Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute, and it's my great delight to welcome you to this Bradley Lecture. Many of you are veterans of the Bradley Lecture Series, and I know you're looking forward to tonight. This is a great treat for us here at AEI. We get to ask the question, do social scientists know anything at all? It's an open question here in an institution populated largely by social scientists, but you have reason for asking this question. If you've been watching the stunning inaccuracy of pollsters, you've noticed that they have gone south so frequently, they've led some of the most prominent politicians of our time astray. What's going on when polls will regularly tell us that an election is going to go one way and be up to 25 or 30 points off on election day? There are other things that should catch our attention as well. There was a paper that just appeared in the journal Science, which replicated 100 of the most highly cited social science experiments that were conducted over the past 10 years. Some of these were social science experiments that got great acclaim. One of them, one of my favorites, from Psychological Science, was entitled Creating Social Connection Through Inferential Reproduction, Loneliness and Perceived Agency in Gadgets, Gods, and Greyhounds. What could this study be all about? Well, I'll tell you what it's about. It purported to prove, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that people, when they're lonely, tend to look at inanimate objects as a source of affection. In other words, and this was taken by the authors as proof, that people who are religious are simply neurotic. Good to know. That's some of you, by the way. So, why do I call that to your attention? Because this paper in Science replicated these 100 most important social science experiments over the past 10 years and found that 2/3 of them were not replicable. 2/3 of them had results that were not distinguishable from random happenings, including the paper that I just cited. What are we to make of this? The polling tells us that we can't predict the future, and the science paper tells us that we can't even predict the past. Where do we go with this? Well, fortunately, we have a friend of AEI and an expert to sort this out. Philip Tetlock joins us, and he has a fabulous new book that he's going to tell us about. Phil is a friend of many of us here at AEI, and I thank Sally Sattel for bringing him here. He's the Annenberg Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has cross appointments in psychology, the Wharton School, and political science. Quite a feat, bringing business and social science together in this way. He's held also the Mitchell Endowed Professorship at the University of California at Berkeley. His new book is Superforecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction, as well as his book, Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know? He's published widely in peer-reviewed journals. He's one of the most consequential social scientists of our generation. He's received awards too numerous for me to list, and besides that, you've come here to listen to Philip Tetlock and not me. Before I get off the podium, I do want to mention in our Bradley Lecture Series that Karl Rove is our next Bradley lecturer. This is his first Washington talk on his new biography of William McKinley. Mark your calendars. That's Tuesday, January 19th. So with that, I turn over the podium now to our friend, Philip Tetlock.
Well, thank you, Arthur, for that very gracious introduction.
I'll turn it on for you. Sure.
There's an And we submitted the data at 9 a.m. Eastern Time every day in a public format. It's totally open, totally transparent. All of the teams competing did that. It was a complicated operation. It was almost like running a bank. You know, it was like wire transfers, except that we were transferring predictions on all of the questions. So I don't think you have to worry too much about the replicability of these results. They're pretty robust. They're very large N's, and the data are totally transparent. The other thing I would say is that in another life, if IARPA hadn't done the really mysterious thing of supporting a forecasting tournament, and it's very unusual for a bureaucracy to sponsor something that has the potential to be as embarrassing as this had, if IARPA hadn't done that, and if I were giving this talk, I would probably be talking about the reproducibility crisis in social science and how a combination of careerist pressure and politicization has produced the current mess. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about something I think is a little more constructive, and that is the findings that have emerged from a quite extraordinary research program that was supported by the U.S. intelligence community for reasons that are impressive. So maybe most of you probably know the brilliant cartoonist Gary Larson. He has a rather grim gallows sense of humor. And most of his cartoons can be approached at two different levels. You know, there's one, the superficial level is, of course, that these guys are idiots. You know, they're not going to see it until they're dead. And the other is a more psychologically deeper point, and that is that the power of preconceptions to shape our perceptions until the bitter end. The last thought that is going to flash through the consciousness of these pilots is going to be a misconception. So, in a sense, the ARPA tournament is about developing a better early warning system than seems to be at work in this cartoon. So, the title of this presentation, I adapted it a little bit from what Sally gave me, Predicting the Future. How can we, what did I say? How much better can we get when we get serious about keeping score? Now, there are some spheres of life in which this would be not at all a controversial question. It would be kind of a slam dunk. A friend of mine works at a big hedge fund, AQR. He's a chief risk officer. He's also a very good poker player. We talk about him in the book to some degree, briefly. And he has an interesting view of how to distinguish world-class players, and he is a world-class poker player, from talented amateurs. And the litmus test is the world-class players know the difference between a 55-45 bet and a 45-55 bet. They're granular in their assessments of uncertainty. Well, that turns out to be very true of superforecasters as well. They're granular in their assessments of uncertainty. Now, when I say that in the context of poker or a number of other contexts as well, people sort of roll their eyes and say, well, Professor, that's pretty obvious, isn't it, that would pay off in a game like poker, because you're sampling from you're sampling from a well-defined universe, you know, the deck of cards. There's repeated play. There's clear feedback, clear rapid feedback on accuracy. That's not exactly world politics, is it? That's not exactly the world that intelligence analysts work with. There's a lot more ambiguity. The events they're dealing with seem to be one-shot historical events. How do you construct a probability distribution around one-shot historical events? Isn't it impossible? How could you possibly become granular in your assessments of whether Greece is going to leave the eurozone, or what mischief Putin is up to, or what's going to happen in the East China Sea and the Sino-Japanese forces there? Lots of questions of that sort that seem to be unique, one-shot historical events. How can you possibly do that? Now, I'm not going to get into a diversion into the philosophy of statistics, but there are two somewhat clashing schools of thought in statistics, one of which, the frequentist school of thought, essentially agrees with what I just said. And that is, boy, it's virtually impossible to move from the poker domain into the domain of world politics. The other, that we call the frequentist school, the other school is the Bayesian school, which is that we're constantly estimating uncertainty, we're constantly making implicit probability judgments, and it's better that those implicit probability judgments become explicit. And if we do that, we will learn. I am, truth be told, in the Bayesian camp. I don't think it would make sense to have participated in the ARPA forecasting tournament if I were an orthodox frequentist. I simply would have said, I just don't think it's possible to get better. But rather than entrenching ourselves in these rival philosophical positions, which have existed for a very long time, I think IARPA took the very constructive step of treating it as a purely pragmatic empirical question. To what extent is it possible to make probability estimates of possible futures of world events more accurate? And the answer to that question is, whoops, it all comes up at once. Well, the answer is quite a bit. It's possible to achieve really pretty substantial improvements. We run control groups in the IARPA forecasting tournaments. These control groups serve the function of giving us a baseline against which to measure whether or not there is improvement. And we can gauge how much we can improve accuracy by selecting elite forecasters and putting them into teams and giving them certain guidelines, by giving regular forecasters training, by giving regular forecasters the opportunity to work in teams, by using various kinds of statistical algorithms that distill wisdom from crowds. So there are many different techniques, psychological and statistical, we can use and to test the hypothesis of whether or not it's possible to achieve improvement above and beyond that of a control group. And using the analogy of the Snell and I chart, which we are all familiar, of course, it's rather analogous to improving your vision from, say, 2100 to 2050. It's still going to be blurry. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to be substantially better. Our forecasters are not Nostradamus-style prophets. They simply have learned to become better at assigning realistic probability estimates to a wide range of outcomes of national security interest. That doesn't mean they're always right. It means that when things happen, on average, they're assigning probabilities somewhere between 72, 76% in that range. And when things don't happen, they're assigning probabilities somewhere between about 24 and 28%. That's a lot better than 60, 40, 40, 60. So the right analogy here is not, the right model is not Nostradamus, it's not prophecy, it's optometry. It's a little pedestrian, but optometry is the right framework for thinking. We're talking about gradualist incremental improvements in probability estimates that were previously thought to be impossible. And that is, I think, the great discovery of the IARPA tournament. And if I had to do this talk in this amount of time, I would simply end right there. That's exactly what was accomplished. Now, how do we know all of this? We know all this because we run forecasting tournaments. And in these forecasting tournaments, we've had tens of thousands of forecasters. They've answered roughly 500 questions of national security relevance. They've done this over a period of 4 years. And in total, we have more than 1 million probability judgments. So we have a fair amount of raw data to work with. Forecasting tournaments are unusual. They're very different from things that you normally run into in life, very different from political games in Washington. They are pure accuracy games. Right? That is all that matters, is who is closer to the truth on what. Who does a better job than whom in assigning higher probabilities to things that happen than to things that don't happen on resolvable questions of national security relevance. That's all that matters. It's not an ideology question. It's a purely pragmatic accuracy question. Forecasting tournaments are, as I think I use the term here, they destabilize stale status hierarchies. Status moves very slowly. Accuracy can change quite quickly. I'm 61 years old. I've been running forecasting tournaments off and on since I was about 30 years old, 1984. Back when there was a Soviet Union, before Gorbachev became General Secretary. So I've been running a lot of forecasting tournaments. And imagine that I'm an analyst inside the CIA. Or imagine I'm a senior China analyst on the National Intelligence Council. I'm the go-to guy when Xi Jinping shows up in town. I help write things for the PDB, Presidential Daily Briefing. I help to craft national intelligence estimates. I'm the alpha dog among sinologists in the IC. And some research group, IARPA, Intelligence Advanced Research Projects activity, comes in and persuades someone like the Office of the Director of National Intelligence or people in that office to do some experiments and run some forecasting tournaments in which, say, 25-year-olds who just came in and are junior China analysts can compete on a level playing field with me. Now, I don't think it takes a great deal of bureaucratic imagination to suppose that I am not going to be very enthusiastic about this development. Right? Now, in the book, we have a tale of Tom Friedman and Bill Flack. And Tom Friedman hasn't reacted to this yet, but it's essentially a story, but Tom Friedman is, of course, an alpha columnist. And Bill Flack is an anonymous superforecaster. He cranked out lots of forecasts over a number of years from his house, actually from a public library in Nebraska. He was a retired hydrologist, irrigation specialist in Nebraska. And we happen to know that he's a darn good forecaster. He's very good at assigning realistic probability estimates to events. And he's a really quick study because these questions are extremely heterogeneous, and he does a pretty good job of coming up with realistic probability estimates faster than other people do in the outside world. And in fact, his estimates are very competitive with those that intelligence analysts inside the community with access to classified information generate. David Ignatius in the Washington Post wrote an article a few years ago which reported some of the early results of the tournament, suggesting that the Good Judgment Project best forecasters and best algorithms could do better than analysts working inside the intelligence community, and he used the numbers 25 to 30%. I don't know how he managed to get this information because I don't think this information is publicly available. But of course, it's the Washington Post, so who knows? they have their ways of doing things. I have no reason to believe that's wrong. In fact, I believe it to be true of other years as well. I don't believe it was just true of the second year. I think it was true of the third and the fourth year of the tournament as well. So that's interesting. And it's interesting why that is. I don't think it's because these so-called super forecasters I'm talking about here are more intelligent or even more open-minded than the intelligence analysts. I think it's because they think it's really worth taking a shot on this. And they think that probability estimation of messy real-world events is a skill that can be cultivated, and it's worth trying to cultivate it. They're willing to take a shot at it. If you take the view that, no, these are unique historical events, there's no way you can assign probability estimates to them, this is stupid, if that's your attitude, it doesn't matter how high your IQ is or how open-minded you are on other topics, you're simply never going to try to do it. And you're never going to get better at it. Just as children in high school who are convinced that they don't like math and never try, never get better at it. It is a fundamental principle. This is one of those take-it-to-the-bank principles of psychology. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition for doing well. Okay, so, whoops, I'm sorry. So forecasting tournaments are pure accuracy games. They can destabilize stale status hierarchies. Most pundits do make forecasts, but the forecasts are framed in terms of vague verbiage. And when you look at vague verbiage forecasts, you discover just how vague they are. You can ask people, for example, what probability range is implied by this forecast in which the forecaster uses the word could, or distinct possibility, or whatnot. And what you find is that these... This one right here, it's a real possibility. Real possibility, the probability range, the imputed probability range from readers is from 0.22 to 0.89. That really covers a lot of territory. And that means, it means never having to say you're sorry. If I said it could happen and it doesn't happen, I could say, oh, I merely said it could, and it does happen. I told you it could. So you've got it pretty much covered. So there's a great deal of ambiguity, and it makes it when you live in a world with that level of ambiguity, it makes it virtually impossible to become granular. Virtually impossible to learn how to make distinguish 55-45 bets from 45-55 bets, the way Aaron Brown says captures the difference between great and not so great poker players. So how great are our thought leaders of today? The short answer is nobody has a clue. Liberals, conservatives, we all have opinions about this. These are just opinions. They are nothing more than that. So the question, how did the Good Judgment Project win the tournament? And it's by assigning more accurate probability estimates is the short answer, but that's not all that informative. That's like saying you win a marathon by running faster. I mean, that doesn't get you very far. What does most accurate mean? Well, the scoring rules we used have been developed over the last 60 or 70 years in psychology, meteorology, and a number of other fields, including statistics. And the basic approach here is imagine for sake of argument here that you're trying to predict whether it's going to rain or not. And we're going to dummy code reality as 0 if it doesn't rain and 1 if it does rain. And you will see the forecaster assigns 0.9 squared plus, thank you very much. You're essentially deviating probabilities from reality. So when you say 90% likelihood of rain and it rains, you get a great Brier score. When you say 50% likelihood, you're not going to get a very good Brier score no matter what happens. When you say 80% likelihood and you're right on the right side, you get a good Brier score again. You average across all days, you get the aggregate Brier score. So you win a forecasting tournament by assigning higher probabilities to things that happen than to things that don't happen and doing it faster than other people. It's as simple as that. Now, the Brier score is called a proper scoring rule because it incentivizes people to report their true beliefs. I can go into more detail on that if you want, but it's basically, it is as if you are betting your credibility the way you would be betting money at a racing track. Okay, so you have a Brier score continuum. The best possible Brier score is 0. Right? Low scores, as in golf, are better. The worst is 2. This is a reverse clairvoyant. This is someone who gets everything absolutely wrong. Someone who, if there were such people, of course, they would be quite useful. And then you've got the dart-throwing chimpanzee in the zone of randomness. Our best forecasters, our super forecasters, can achieve Brier scores between about 0.15 and 0.2 typically in a year. Regular forecasters are more around 0.4. The regular forecasters are still better than chance, but not a lot better than chance. Now, I'm going to stay over here. Now, Brier scores break into 2 components. When you think about what's good judgment, there are 2 key. It's a quadratic scoring rule. You can do some high school algebra. You can decompose it into 2 components. One's called calibration. The other's called resolution. You can be perfectly calibrated but have poor resolution. So you could be a forecaster who never says anything more than minor shades of maybe. You never go below a 40% likelihood of something happening. You never go above a 60% likelihood of something happening. But within that area, you're perfectly calibrated. So when you say 55% likelihood of something happening, those things happen 55% of the time. But you're not all that informative or interesting to listen to because you never really go beyond minor shades of maybe. So you're perfect calibration but poor resolution. What you really want, what a great forecaster would look like, would be right along the diagonal. When the forecaster says 90% likelihood, and the forecaster does sometimes go out on a limb and say 90% likelihood, things happen 90% of the time. 10% likelihood, things happen 10% of the time. 50% likelihood, things happen 50% of the time. And then, of course, there's the God profile, which would be a probability of 1, everything happened, it always happens. Probability of 0, it never happens. That would be perfect omniscience. So that would be God, or an omniscient God, or it'd be also Laplace's demon, but depending on your theological preferences. So now you know how to score them. How do the super forecasters manage to get such great accuracy scores across so heterogeneous an array of problems? And I mean really heterogeneous. I mean they're going from predicting Grexit to what's going on in the Ukraine, to Syrian refugee flows, to H5N1, just think all Arctic sea ice even. I mean, an extraordinarily heterogeneous array of problems. How did they manage to do it? So the book discusses this in much more detail. I'm going to discuss very quickly 4 interesting, distinctive attributes of superforecaster cognitive strategies in decoding an uncertain world. And we can talk about that more, each of those more, and others in more detail later. Winning requires picking your battles wisely. So if you know your high school physics, you should be able to predict Foucault's pendulum, the motion of Foucault's pendulum, perfectly accurately. You have a great deterministic theory of a perfectly deterministic system. You know, you're moving toward the God zone on the Brier score continuum. Here, there's no such thing as an expert in roulette. It's a pure chance game. You can look for patterns until the cows come home. You're wasting your time. And super forecasters know better than to waste their time on intractable problems. There's a Goldilocks zone of questions in which analytical effort pays off to some degree. And the only way you're going to win a forecasting tournament is if you're prudent enough to allocate your effort primarily in the Goldilocks zone. Here, you're just wasting your effort on roulette-style problems, and on Foucault's problems, in general, for this level of sophistication, most people, if there are deterministic, easy-to-spot regularities, almost everybody else gets them too. So you're not going to win that way. But hurricanes, I mean, that's an interesting case because meteorologists, who have a terrible reputation but ill-deserved, because they're among the best calibrated professionals ever studied, that's because they've been keeping score for 50 years. They've been disciplining themselves. They have subjected themselves to the rigors of, in effect, forecasting tournaments. They get quick, clear feedback on how close their probability estimates are to reality. And they've learned, using a combination of human judgment and their models, which have become increasingly sophisticated as well, they've gotten pretty good at predicting hurricanes. Now, of course, they can't predict when and where a hurricane is going to form, because you have butterfly effects and all that kind of thing. That's impossible. But once a hurricane reaches a certain level of maturity, they're pretty darn good at predicting whether it's going to hit South Carolina or it's going to go further north or it's going to hit Florida. They're pretty good at that. There are these little spaghetti diagrams you may have sometimes seen on the Weather Channel that plot various possible trajectories, and usually there's a cluster, the high probability cluster of little spaghetti strands that tells you where the hurricane is likely to go. Hurricane prediction has gotten much better over the last 5 decades, and I think it has saved us billions of dollars and probably many lives. So I think it's a valuable thing to have done. Now, in forecasting these kinds of geopolitical events, you have to have some sense for where the Goldilocks zone is. And I'll be glad to talk more about how exactly they did that later. Another thing that super forecasters are pretty good at is using what Danny Kahneman calls the outside view in generating their probability judgments. So imagine you're a forecaster in a tournament, and IARPA decides to ask you whether some dictator in sub-Saharan Africa is going to survive another year in power. And you look at this question, you scratch your head, and you say, what country is that? What dictator is that? You're really pretty clueless about, you're starting from a very low level of sophistication on that particular problem. You know almost nothing about the inside of the problem. But you do have some statistical information that's fairly readily available. You can quite readily find out, for example, how likely dictators are to survive, given that they have been in power a certain number of years. How likely are they to survive another year? And the short answer is dictators are very likely to survive another year as a base rate, maybe 90% plus. Now, that doesn't mean that's your probability estimate for this problem. It does mean it's not a bad place to start. Now, if you then discover that the dictator we're talking about is 91 years old and has advanced prostate cancer, you might want to shift your probability estimate somewhat. If you also learn that there are major riots in the capital city, again, you want to shift your estimate somewhat. But starting from a reasonable base rate is a good way to win forecasting tournaments. Another thing that winning requires, and this is a somewhat difficult thing to wrap our heads around, requires avoiding both over and underreacting to news. So one thing super forecasters are pretty good at doing is they're pretty good at avoiding being sucker punched. They're pretty good at discounting pseudo-diagnostic news to which the crowd overreacts. And this happens over and over again. And you never know ex ante whether they're doing it right, but if you keep score long enough, it becomes apparent that they're doing something right. Most forecasters in the spring of 2012, I guess, the Moscow Spring, the big demonstrations against Putin, hundreds of thousands of courageous people coming out in the streets to protest against Putin, a lot of forecasters said, my God, this looks like Putin is shaky, and the probability of Putin's survival and the crowd belief took a spike down. The super forecasters were pretty much constant. Putin is staying. They weren't swayed by that information very much. Another thing the super forecasters did that kind of surprised me was Grexit. I thought there was a higher probability of a Greek exit from the eurozone than they did, and one of the things that they discounted quite a bit was the harsh background rhetoric that was coming from the finance ministers of Greece and Germany. They sort of discounted that, and they focused more on the principles, and they focused on certain other variables I can mention later. But again, they were not swayed by factors that in retrospect we now know they should not have been. The other thing they're good at is spotting subtly diagnostic news to which the crowd underreacts. So they were very quick to recognize that Putin was going to be taking over Medvedev's job, and that Medvedev was giving up the job. One way that was partly because they were working with the mental model that had a lot of power being centralized in Putin, but it was possible that Putin might want to keep Medvedev in the job another 4 years, because he was still calling the shots behind the scenes. But Putin decided he wanted to take the job. How did they know? What made them so confident of that? What made them spike up? Prior to the announcement in September, early September of 2011, the spike up, Russian aviation has a terrible safety record, as many of you may know. There was a terrible accident in which a large fraction of Russia's best hockey players were killed in an aviation accident. This is a perfect opportunity for a politician to get out front and say, look, I'm the guy who's going to clean up aviation. I'm going to find who's responsible for this, and blah, blah, blah. This, Sherlock Holmes once solved the case by the dog not observing that the dog did not bark, hence that the intruder must have been known to the family. Well, this was the politician who didn't bark. And the smart money moved in response to the non-event. The smart money, another example is another reason why the super forecasters were pretty confident that Brexit wasn't going to happen in the time frame people thought it might this year, was that Greek didn't seem to have a plan B. Okay, so winning requires avoiding over and underreacting to news. And winning requires moving beyond blame game ping pong, which I think is a particularly pernicious thing in Washington, D.C. The intelligence community is whipsawed between clashing critiques. On the one hand, they're criticized for over-connecting the dots, say, on WMD in Iraq. On the other hand, they're accused of under-connecting the dots and false negative on 9/11. If you're a forecaster and you work in a world in which you're simply hammered relentlessly for your most recent mistake, and you have no incentives to develop a more accurate system for generating forecasts, you are simply going to shift your threshold for avoiding mistakes. Oh, I made a false positive mistake. I'll make darn sure I'm not going to make that one again. And then until you have a false negative, in which case I'm going to make sure I don't make that one again. You kind of ping pong back and forth. Super forecasters really do get it. They get it that they understand what good judgment means. And in engineering terms, these are receiver operating characteristic curves. What it means is good judgment means your ability to achieve a very high hit rate at a very low false alarm rate. I mean, any idiot can predict every war that's going to occur between now and year 3000 by simply predicting war always. Right? That's not a great predictive accomplishment. A great predictive accomplishment is achieving a very high hit rate for your curve to go up very fast early on at a very low false positive rate. Now, if I'm along this curve here, let's say the intelligence community is working along this accuracy curve, all they need to do to cope with political accountability pressures from Congress and from the public is, oh, we made this one error, we're going to move down and avoid that error here. They can simply go back and forth. They're not improving. Improved accuracy means achieving a better hit rate at a lower false positive rate, or achieving a lower false positive rate at the same hit rate or better hit rate. Insofar as you can do that, you are genuinely learning. The super forecasters create little cultures within their teams in which they try really hard to avoid mechanistic, blame game, ping pong forms of learning, and to build up a reservoir of knowledge that will allow them to achieve improvements in aggregate accuracy over time. They get it. They understand what accuracy means. And this is a trans-ideological meaning, by the way. It may mean that liberals would prefer that you would make this trade-off, conservatives would prefer you make this trade-off, and you can oscillate back and forth along this function. But both liberals and conservatives should agree that they want to be on a higher ROC curve. That's just a Pareto improvement. It's just a better world. Now, so one question is, how did the super forecasters do it? Another question is, how did the Good Judgment Project do it? So Good Judgment Project initially got started when I was at the University of California, Berkeley. It continued through my wife and I, Barb Mellers, were co-PIs, and we continued with us at the University of Pennsylvania. How exactly did the Good Judgment Project pull it off? There were four big factors, I think, that drove our performance relative to other university-based teams that were participating in the tournament. One was getting the right people on the bus, spotting and cultivating talent. We were pretty elitist about that. The term superforecasters implies that we're not afraid of being accused of elitism, I guess. So spotting and cultivating talent, teaming, anti-groupthink groups, teaching people how to disagree without being disagreeable, engaging in what Andy Grove at Intel used to call constructive confrontation. So getting the groups to work the right way. There's a big disagreement within our research program, but where there's a good idea to put people in teams. Because teams have a bad reputation, and quite deservedly so for the most part, because teams often are associated with conformity and laziness and lots of pathologies. But if you engineer the team right, it really does prove to be an engine of progress. We had various debiasing exercises, which I could talk about in more detail, but basically teaching people how to use principles of probabilistic reasoning more effectively in their analysis. And then finally, our statisticians deserve a lot of credit for winning this tournament. And this is, they were just better at distilling wisdom from crowds. Part of what they did was quite obvious. They not only created the average, right? So there's a well-known averaging effect. The average of a group of forecasters tends to be more accurate than the majority of the forecasters from whom the average was derived, the James Surowiecki wisdom of the crowd thing. But they refined that by doing weighted averaging, which is giving more weight to the better forecasters, more intelligent, better track record, and so forth. But they did something more than that, and that's somewhat counterintuitive. They extremized to compensate for what's called the conservatism of aggregates. And I want to talk a little bit about that because it reveals something quite interesting about human judgment. And I want to use the context of President Obama's decision to go after Osama bin Laden. And I want to look at it through the lens of the Good Judgment Project framework. How many of you have seen the movie Zero Dark 30? Probably many of you. And you won't be astonished to learn that Hollywood didn't get it entirely right. So it's Hollywood versus history. You have a scene in which, and I guess there's a scene with Leon Panetta being played by the great James Gandolfini. Leon Panetta asking a group of advisors around him how likely is Osama bin Laden to be in the compound in Abbottabad, and they give various probability estimates. There's in the Bowden book and in other sources, President Obama goes through a very similar process with a group of advisors around him. Let's just imagine as a thought experiment, let's put aside what the actual numbers people offered were for just a minute and just do a thought experiment. Imagine you're the president and your senior intelligence advisors offer you probability estimates on this question, and each one of them says, Mr. President, I think it's 0.7. 0.7, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. What should you, the president, conclude from the fact all your advisors say 0.7? And most people say, well, duh, I'll have 0.7. That is true if the advisors are clones of each other. But it's not true if the advisors are not clones of each other. Imagine that the advisors are siloized. Each advisor is drawing on very different information, applying different analytical principles to different types of information, and has worked independently of the others. And each one says 0.7, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. Diversity is a bit of a mantra, of course, in the business world and in government, but this actually is real diversity at work. This is the real value of diversity, because what's the answer now? Is it still 0.7, or is it something more like 0.85 or 0.9? Now, the answer is not mathematically determinate, because I haven't given you enough information, but it is something that's statistically estimatable. And that's what our statisticians are really good at doing. They're really good at figuring out how to take the weighted average of the best forecasters and then to extremize as a function of the amount of diversity in those forecasts. Very clever idea. It seemed dangerous at the time because they were then submitting forecasts that, weighted average might have been 0.7, but after the algorithmic magic, 0.7 was 0.85 or 0.9. It worked really well. Now, does it ever crash and burn? Yes, it sometimes does crash and burn, and I want to come back to that point as well. So now President Obama, in fact, in the real world apparently, he didn't get 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. He got a variety of different estimates that ranged apparently from, I don't know, maybe a few of them might have been a little less than 0.5, but they're still pretty high. And some of them were up to 0.95. and the center of gravity seemed to be around 0.75. And President Obama, when he got these estimates from the analysts, his reaction apparently was to shrug and say, look, guys, I don't know what to do with this. It feels 50-50 to me. Now, that is a fascinating reaction, 50-50. Now, imagine President Obama had been sitting around in the living room of a TV room in the White House with some friends watching a March Madness basketball game about to start. And they said, what's the likelihood of Duke University winning this game? And the people around say, yeah, maybe 0.4, 0.7, 0.9, 0.9, 0.85. And let's say that the median of those probability judgments is exactly the same as the median for the Osama judgments, 0.75. Would President Obama have shrugged and say, sounds like 50-50? Or would he have said, sounds like 3-1, 3-1 Duke? I think we know that he's a pretty sports literate guy. You would have said 3-1. Why didn't he say that here? Why the degradation of granularity when it matters so much to become more granular? When granularity really matters. Why are we reserving our most rigorous forms of probabilistic reasoning for our most trivial activities? That is the question. Because we don't believe it's possible to make quantitative probability judgments of these things. We're very skeptical of those judgments, hence it just feels like 50-50. So that's a mindset problem. I think the data from the IARPA tournament indicate that we do need a mindset shift. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is the ways in which forecasting tournaments can be used to improve the quality of debate in our society. And I don't know if I spelled forget about it correctly here, but what about the forget about it pessimist? What matters can't be forecast, and what can be forecast doesn't matter. The rigor-relevance trade-off. You can imagine versions of that objection, and there is some truth to it. There is some truth to it. What the rebuttal is, the work that I intend to be doing in the next several years, the final work of my career before I retire, I think, and it's on adversarial collaboration and Bayesian question clustering. What does that mean, adversarial collaboration? Imagine we've got two camps on Iran. And there are people who think the Iranian nuclear accord is a pretty good deal, pretty prudent, and people who think it's a terrible idea. And they shout at each other, and they write rival op-eds, and they denounce each other. Imagine that you asked each side, okay, there's uncertainty about how this agreement's going to unfold. There's uncertainty about what's going to happen in the next year and 2 years and 3 years. We want you to come up with 10 questions that you think your side has a comparative advantage in answering. And we ask that of each side to come up with 10 questions that it thinks will shed some light on who is right about this dispute and that they think they have a comparative advantage in answering. So you're assembling clusters of small questions to address a big one. The big question, is this a good idea or not, you can't put into a forecasting tournament because it's way too vague and it's not resolvable. The only questions you can put into forecasting tournaments are questions that pass the clairvoyance test. It passes the clairvoyance test if I could hand the question to a genuine clairvoyant. Clairvoyant could peer into the future and then say, yes or no, it did or didn't happen. So it's got to be clear cut. So it's got to be something about, well, maybe, I don't know, how many kilograms, will Iran have less than 300 kilograms of low enrichment uranium by date X? Or will reformists have a plurality of seats in the Iranian parliament by date X? Or will they test a multi-stage rocket? Or will they do this, will they do that? These are all issues that some of these questions would come from liberals, some would come from conservatives. I will submit to you that I think the process of participating in an adversarial collaboration tournament of this form would motivate people to be more circumspect and thoughtful than they otherwise would. A bit reminiscent of the famous Samuel Johnson line about the gallows concentrating the mind. The prospect of imminent embarrassment can also concentrate the mind. You don't want the other side to have better probability estimates than your side had. So it's going to create a competition in accuracy rather than a competition in polemics. And I believe that that mechanism could improve the quality of policy debates. Same thing for China. We have an exercise we've started on China, and will there be the interdiction of U.S. forces, a violent clash with Japan, fishing disputes, Chinese defense spending, selling UAVs, so forth. People who are more pessimistic or more optimistic about Chinese geopolitical intent. Zeke Emanuel is a colleague at Berkeley, and of course he was very prominent in the Obama administration in the design of Obamacare. And I persuaded him to nominate 5 questions for potential adversarial collaboration. I thought there might be someone here who might want to take him up on it. Whoever you are, if there are experts on healthcare, I would really, really welcome your participation in this tournament. I think it wouldn't just be Zeke on the liberal side. There should be a team of people on the liberal side, a team of people on the conservative side, each dedicated to answering probative questions. Now, I think Sally mentioned to me that she showed some of the Zeke's questions to someone who said that the questions were a bit on the boring side. There's some truth to that. Forecasting tournament questions are not as glamorous as the big debate questions. Zeke's questions are somewhat technical and nitpicky questions about what the uninsured rate is going to be, the growth of state exchanges, healthcare inflation. And he's focusing mostly on questions having to do with equality and inflation. And I think people on the other side of the debate might choose to focus questions on other things, or they might choose to challenge those particular forecasts as well. I don't know how. I'm not an expert on healthcare. I'm not an expert on Iran. I'm not an expert on China. I'm not an expert on any of these things. But I do believe, from a psychologist point of view, from a political psychological point of view, that this adversarial collaboration framework is a useful framework for incentivizing people to become more thoughtful than they otherwise would. So my final slide is stopping conversation stoppers. The naysayers, the forget about it pessimists. It's just impossible to assess the accuracy of probability judgments because, you can't do it, right? It's just impossible to make meaningful probability judgments of unique events because you just can't do it. It's impossible to get better at making probability judgments of unique events. I think all 3 of these things have been shown fairly categorically to be wrong on the basis of the IARPA forecasting tournament data. It is possible to get better. It's not always possible to get better in every domain. There'll be some domains that really are intractable and improvement is impossible. But I will propose to you that the strong form of these objections has been shown to be false. And that finally, it's impossible to pose questions that are both rigorously resolvable and deeply relevant because what can be forecast doesn't matter and what matters can't be forecast. I think we can get around that with goodwill among teams of rivals who make a good faith effort to generate questions that they think will stump the other side and then make good faith efforts to assign realistic probability estimates to them. So I think we're in the process of starting to do this. We have not succeeded yet. But this is if there's any goal I have for the remainder of my forecasting tournament research career, it is in this domain here. And then there's another objection that even if you could do all these things here, you'll never persuade the intelligence community to expose itself to competition, which they did do to some degree in the IARPA tournament, or persuade high-status pundits to put their credibility on the line. That may be true. I don't know if have I overstayed my welcome yet? Timing is about 45 minutes? Sure. Okay, why don't we open it up to questions and move forward?
I'm supposed to call on people.
I'm sorry?
No, I was supposed to call on people. Thank you so much for fabulous. And I predicted it would be. Sir?
Hi, this is fascinating. I'm an epistemologist, and the question I have, I'm an epistemological question, that's my field, and I've gotten interested in judgment from that standpoint. Can you tell us anything that your research has turned up regarding the actual cognitive processes that your super forecasters use? The results are really striking, but inside the actual processes they're using, whether logical or observational, whatever.
Yes. When the book was being reviewed by some of the leading experts in the field, people like Danny Kahneman and by Aaron Brown in finance, it's interesting what most impressed them about superforecasters. And it wasn't that they were hardworking. It wasn't even that they were that granular, although granularity did impress them, 55, 45, 45, 55. What most impressed them was an obscure phenomenon known as temporal scope sensitivity, which does, I think, shed some light on how they think differently from ordinary mortals. Imagine I ask you the question, how likely is, well, now that Putin's intervened, Assad's looking a lot more stable, but let's say back in 2012, we asked you the question, which we did actually, the forecasters, how likely is Assad to survive in power for the next 3 months or the next 6 months? Or the next year, 3, 6, 12 months. Most people, when they answer that question, form a mental model in which they say, well, what are the forces that are preserving Assad? What are the forces that are challenging them? What's the relative strength of those forces? Now I'm going to translate that ratio into some kind of probability judgment. And if you think that way, it's not an unreasonable way to think. It's not a bad first order approximation. If you think that way, you're going to fall prey to something that Kahneman calls scope insensitivity. And that is, the answer you're going to give to the question, how likely is he to survive in 12 months, is going to be very similar, disturbingly similar to the answer you're going to give to 3 months, because the ratio of strength isn't really calibrated to time. It's interesting that super forecasters do calibrate their judgments to time, in a way that I think, if it impresses people on, if there's something that impresses, I think, the best psychologists and the best people on Wall Street, is probably the temporal scope sensitivity aspect. Timing does matter. That's a somewhat technical answer, but I think that would be my. There are other answers too, but I think that would be the best one for now.
Easier for you to do it?
Pardon me?
Might be easier for you to just call people.
Well, since I have this, I have a little bit of a glare problem with my vision, so it might be fairer to people if you did it.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. John Graham from the National Center for Policy Analysis. And my question is specific to the Greek exit. You said the super forecasters discounted statements from the finance ministers of Greece and Germany that ordinary mortals would put more weight on them. And I just wonder, a more general question is, we know politicians, when they say something, it's meaningless blather, right? We all know that, and yet ordinary mortals, we spend an inordinate amount of time listening to politicians. Like we fantasize that we're going to learn something from the debates, So why are we so subject to that kind of bias when we know it's all nonsense?
Well, I think that a lot of the time in the social, what's the base rate for human conversation? Most of the time when we're talking to people, there is an implicit assumption that they're telling us the truth and they're trying to be informative. The philosopher Grice called these the axioms of conversation. And I think that's pretty true. I think we extend that into the political sphere, and we sort of make an implicit assumption of good faith in the political sphere, even though we know in the back of our heads that's really stupid. and the incentives are really pretty perverse in the political realm. I think we do extend that courtesy of everyday life to politicians, and we are punished for it often.
Thank you. Hi, Paul Reinke. I'm a super forecaster. When we did the Grexit issue, okay, we didn't disregard, okay? Let's not confuse discount with disregard. We accounted for the rhetoric, but then we looked beyond that for the maneuverability of both sides and what did they have to work with, what were the realities that they were facing. Then we discounted the rhetoric. So when you're in a situation, as we're trying now to forecast a national election in this country, well, we don't yet know what the maneuverability is. So in this respect, it is a lot of blather. Time will peel that back a little bit.
An appropriately nuanced super forecaster response.
Question, did you participate in your own tournament? And if so, are you a super forecaster? Reading the book, you did come up with a list of things that almost anyone could do to become a super forecaster. So it seems like if anyone could have done it, you would have. So I'm just curious.
Well, I do have a day job. No, well, no, the super forecasters have day jobs too, and it reminds me of a famous put down of our best forecasters by a famous political scientist, Bruce Benedict Mesquita, when we were trying to get him to compete in this, that he didn't want to compete against unemployed news junkies. I think very highly of Bruce, by the way. I think he's a brilliant political scientist, but I do think that was somewhat unfair. Am I a super forecaster? Well, the answer is yes and no. Here's the story. In year 2, I did actually try to keep up with the questions and make forecasts. But I was also monitoring the algorithms, so I was well aware of what our best algorithms were doing. I also knew that our best algorithms from year 1, if you had simply made the prediction that our best algorithm made in year 1, you would have been better than 99.9% of forecasters. I think there's only one forecaster in year 1 who actually beat the algorithm. So you would have been number 2 if you had simply mindlessly followed the algorithm. So if I had done that, I could have cheated, right? And I could have become a super forecaster by simply following the algorithm. And I knew from the research literature that people who try to beat algorithms are often punished for it. But I did. It's an irresistible temptation. I saw the algorithm overshooting or undershooting here or there, and I couldn't help but say, I'm going to deviate from the algorithm here or there. And I was rewarded accordingly. Instead of coming in second, I came in 35th. So that still would have qualified me as a super forecaster. But I don't think I'm really. Am I a super forecaster? No, I don't qualify technically because I had access to information none of them had. So I don't think my achievements do not warrant that label. Yes. Or sorry.
Mr. McManus.
Doyle McManus from the Los Angeles Times. I may be one of those pundits who's part of the problem and not part of the solution. You mentioned that there have been cases in which the model crashed and burned. Talk a little bit about those. Are there commonalities? Are there lessons to draw?
There sure are. There sure are. When you extremize and you turn, say, a 0.7 into a 0.85 or a 0.9, you're going to take a big Brier score penalty if the event occurs. And the penalties become quite steep the more extreme your overconfidence is. So the penalties for erroneous extremizing are quite steep in the Brier scoring scheme. I think whenever you're moving into a forecasting domain in which there are large pockets of irreducible uncertainty, currency markets, commodity markets, accidental clashes among military forces that are in close proximity to each other in tense situations. If you extremize in those sorts of situations, you're really extremizing at your peril. We were not able to formalize the conditions under which extremizing should or shouldn't be used. It was so powerful it won, but there were a few occasions in those situations where they got some horrendously bad Brier scores. Now the other scores were so ridiculously good that it was a blowout on the tournament.
Because random stuff happens.
Yes, exactly. So you want to throttle back on extremizing when you sense irreducible uncertainty. That would be the short answer to that question. And the better you are at sensing irreducible uncertainty, the better you will be positioned to take advantage of extremizing without crashing and burning.
Hi, Dave Price, retired reporter and educator. If I were putting together a sports team, I'd look at certain characteristics, maybe speed, size, ability to understand instruction, put it in place. If I were putting together a super forecasting team, what are the skills that I'm looking for? And the only one I'll take away is previous success. So I'm getting new people, and I say, I really want this. What am I looking for? Are there such characteristics? I guess is the first question. If they are, what are they?
This is something we did not fully capitalize on. We put super forecasters together in teams based on their performance, but we didn't try to assemble teams that had optimal diversity characteristics. So you might argue from the diversity argument on underlying extremizing, you might argue from that you would have been better off having super forecaster teams that have some liberals and some conservatives. that have some hawks and have some doves, that have some boomsters and have some doomsters, that have ideological diversity, viewpoint diversity, and let that, and also perhaps complementary forms of geographic and functional expertise. I think those, in another forecasting tournament in which we had even more resources, and IARPA put a lot of resources into this. This was very generously funded research by social science standards. But in an even more generously funded research program, which there are even more questions, we have more opportunities to refine these algorithms. I think you would want to aim for those kinds of complementarities in your super forecasting team, but you'd also have to make sure that they don't get at each, or at each other's throats, because one of the problems with diversity in the business literature is that diverse teams often don't function very well together. So it's tricky to say exactly how I would do it. I think that the individual difference correlates of being a super forecaster, the personality, the cognitive ability correlates, and the behavioral attitudinal correlates, I think we would select for those because I think those have been proven to be pretty robust predictors of performance, and those are all laid out in the book. But I think the next stage would be something along the lines of what you have in mind here with teams. You need someone who's going to be a good guard, who's going to be a good, you need those kinds of attributes, and that will of course hinge on the types of problems we're also trying to deal with. So this is more of a technical problem for people inside the IC where they actually have these massive resources, right? So instead of having, you have a $50 billion system rather than a $5 million system. Yeah.
Charles Murray has a question.
Charles Murray, AEI. Well, obviously, somebody could make $1 zillion with what you're doing, and there's got to be things going on where people are trying to run with it. Could you talk about that?
Well, indeed. IARPA encouraged the Good Judgment Project to develop a private sector spin-off, and the project manager from the Good Judgment Project, Terry Murray, who probably played as crucial a role as anybody in the triumph of the Good Judgment Project, is now the Chief Executive Officer of Good Judgment, Inc., which is dealing with some private sector entities, mostly in New York City. And then she's working with some super forecasters, and she's working with some postdoc people who previously were postdocs and decided to go into the business instead of academia with her. We'll see if that's a viable enterprise. It's interesting that IARPA wanted that to happen. It obviously wanted its research to be of use to the intelligence community, but also another benchmark, I guess, that it seems to use is whether it spawns viable private sector spin-offs. Whether it is a viable private sector spin-off, we'll see. I don't know if it's a slam dunk, by the way, because what we haven't done, I mean, the real slam dunk for making big money here is being able to go directly against deep liquid markets and beat them, right? I think what we're picking here is more of the low-hanging geopolitical risk factor fruit, things that are relevant to markets but aren't directly priced into markets.
What role does accountability play in accuracy? So if you're an intelligence analyst and you're having to report to a boss or report to the president, how does that affect your judgment? And then if you're being accountable to a teammate, what role did that accountability play?
Oh my goodness, that is almost like a gift question to me, because that's in one of my other research lives. I studied accountability a lot, and we did experiments on accountability in the IARPA tournament. What kind of accountability do analysts work within inside the IC? It's overwhelmingly a process form of accountability. There are standards for good analytical practice, and you make sure manager's job is to make sure that the analysts are avoiding the confirmation bias. They're doing this, they're doing that. A series of things. There's a checklist of things that they're supposed to avoid, and you're going to get a good performance rating if your boss says you're engaging a good process, even if you missed that North Korean missile test, and even if you missed this or that. It's not accuracy or outcome accountability. It's process accountability. The IARPA tournament is exactly the opposite. In principle, IARPA didn't care if we used Ouija boards. I mean, all that mattered was accuracy. Now, we wouldn't have gotten the funding if we'd been proposing to use Ouija boards, but so we were proposing to use all the state-of-the-art techniques, but it's a pure accuracy game, and what happens is, of course, in a pure accuracy game, you focus on accuracy, and you can get quite a bit better at it. What happens when you manipulate? We created a condition in year 4 in which we told forecasters that we weren't going to measure their accuracy. We didn't really care about their accuracy. We just care about the quality of the rationales you generate. And that their accuracy suffered. Now, you say, well, boy, the IC should move toward outcome accountability. I think they should embrace outcome accountability more because I think process accountability can degenerate into bureaucratic box checking. I think James Q. Wilson had some beautiful essays on bureaucracy that I think are very apropos here. But I don't dismiss process accountability totally because here's something that came out of that experiment. It's true their accuracy suffered, but when you look at the explanations they generated, they were better than the explanations the pure outcome people were generating because the pure outcome people hadn't been incentivized to communicate their thoughts. They're just focusing on accuracy. And the IC needs communication. And when you take the explanations the pure process accountability people were generating in the tournament and you hand them off to other forecasters and you see how much it helps other forecasters make better forecasts, the process accountability people are doing better at helping other people become more accurate. So it's a kind of a gift they're making to the collective good. So you clearly do need process accountability for codification of knowledge within the organization. You clearly need process accountability because sometimes it's just patently unfair to blame people for predicting certain things that are just utterly capricious. There are lots of reasons why you need process accountability, but if you go as far in the process accountability direction as the IC has gone, I think it ossifies into bureaucratic box checking. So what you need are hybrid forms of accountability that blend process and outcome in the right way. Now, there are various organizations in the private sector I've seen that really are pretty clever at this. And I'm just going to mention one that I have had an opportunity to see a bit on the inside is Goldman Sachs. And Goldman Sachs is kind of maybe a politically toxic organization in some minds. But when you look at how much time they devote, they value their managers' time a lot. And when you look at how much time, managerial time they devote to getting their managers to evaluate their employees on both process and outcome dimensions, it's a very impressive thing to behold, and I think the IC could learn from that.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Andrei Sitov. I'm a Russian reporter here in Washington, D.C. It was very interesting for me to listen to your talk. I did not expect it at all that you would mention Russia so many times in your presentation and Russian-related subjects. 2 questions. I assume those were the actual subjects that you covered in your studies, right? So maybe to put it in a question form, my question would be, were there people who actually predicted before the collapse of the Soviet Union that it would happen? Or to take a more recent example, like before the Crimean operation of the Russians, was it also predicted in your test studies? That is question number 1. Question number 2, again, being a Russian and not knowing anything about this, I know that a lot of people simply believe in people sort of clairvoyance, people with special gifts, like monks, for instance. And Putin, by the way, is supposed to consult some of these people. So my question to you, again in a question form, is have you as a scientist ever come across such quote-unquote freaks who can basically guess the future much better than a statistical average? Thank you.
Many questions. Many questions. I think no. The answers. More seriously, extremely difficult to. I mean, I was doing forecasting tournaments, but of a very different sort on subject matter experts in the 1980s, and I think there were very few experts, virtually none, to my recollection, who really were assigning more than a 50% probability to the disintegration of the Soviet Union within the 5-year frame after 1988, which is when some questions were asked. I'm sorry? Crimea, again, no. I mean, it was a failure of question generation on our part. I think that if you had asked experts that if the Ukraine moves in a dramatically pro-Western direction, is Putin likely to react? I think people would have responded to that conditional in a more affirmative way. I think at the time, say, of the Sochi Olympics, say, it really wasn't on many people's radar screens. If we had asked a question about the Russian annexation of the Crimea, I suspect the probability would have been very low. If we'd asked a conditional about if there is a revolution in Kiev, what's the likelihood? I think the conditional would have been substantially higher. It hinges on having the. So this raises a great point, which is that forecasting tournaments are only as good as the quality of the questions that populate the tournament. That's why the next generation of forecasting tournaments should focus much more heavily on generating high-quality questions. Adversarial collaboration is one step in that direction. I think there are other steps that can be taken as well. The reason, all we have done so far really is a proof of concept, which is that we can improve probability judgments of ostensibly unique events. It's worth doing. It's worth trying. The next step, I think, is to show that we can generate high-quality questions that can tip the scales of plausibility within policy debates, and we can infuse those policy debates with better probability estimates and make political debate more civilized and bring it out of the dark ages. I'm sorry, about which? The freaks. No, I've never come across them. We have a super forecaster here. I wouldn't characterize him as a freak. No, the super forecasters, are really a decidedly pretty well-adjusted group, and they're not unusual. They're unusually smart and open-minded, but they're otherwise not all that unusual. The people who make really radical, far-out predictions that prove to be right sometimes, the hedgehog heavy hitters that I studied in the earlier work, they have one or two really big hits, and in a sea of error, and that's, I think, the way it works roughly. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. I've been an admirer of your work for a long time. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'd like to have your response to a few ideas about the concept of adversarial collaboration. It's fascinating to me because most of your people that you train, and presumably the super forecasters, are Westerners, Americans. And we are notorious around the world for being highly individualistic and highly adversarial. And you could see this down to the intimacy in families, this tendency. So it would seem to me to be very difficult to get people in the real world to, and not just in a test or a competition, to achieve genuine focus on collaboration, a common goal. Now in Asia, the opposite problem. There's a very strong group ethos, but not a strong one. They certainly tend to suppress the idea of adversarial, and even to a certain extent of individualism. So how would what you've worked out fit into or be affected by such different cultural backgrounds? Because after all, the culture of the participants includes everybody, not just the individual personality.
I'm a big believer that in research, you start by crawling, and then you start to walk, and then you start to run. And in the domain about the adversarial collaboration research, it's very, very hard. My initial experience is it's extremely difficult to engineer this. And that if we're successful in engineering 3 or 4 viable adversarial collaborations on high visibility topics in Washington, D.C., I would count that as a major success. I don't know how to generalize that to other cultures. I think there's some truth to what you're saying about the individualism, collectivism, Asian difference. Kind of more of a question for Dick Nisbet than for me, perhaps. I would punt on that one right now. I have my hands full just doing it here and now.
I would suggest another Nisbet who was here at AEI, Robert Nisbet,
Ah.
who focused a lot on this.
Yeah, I was referring to Richard. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
One more quick question and one more quick answer. Sir?
Bruce Greenberg from Brinkman Publishing Company. I'm very much intrigued by your approach. There are other forecasters using formal models, one of whom comes to mind is Bruce Bueno de Mesquita.
Yeah.
Coalition formation.
Yeah.
Have you evaluated his work? How does his work compared to the experts you're talking about?
Yeah, we would love to run a forecasting tournament that pits the super forecasting teams against Bruce Buendía-Mesquita's game theory models, and it would be very expensive to run, and it hasn't proven to be possible logistically at this point. But I hope it happens someday. It's a natural thing to occur.
Thank you so much. That was spectacular. So don't forget Karl Rove on January 19th and books outside to sign. Thank you so much.
Sorry to make you do all this stuff. I'm having this.